All right. Welcome, everyone. This is Authors in Conversation from the University of Florida Press. I am Stephanye Hunter. I'm the acquiring editor for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And I'm so thrilled today that we have two of our authors, Elizabeth Manley, author of The Paradox of Paternalism, Women in the Politics of Authoritarianism in the Dominican Republic, and Heather Hennes, who translated the letters of Minerva, Mirabal, and Manolo Tavárez, Love and Resistance in the Time of Trujillo. And Beth's book is coming out in paperback in June, I believe. And Heather's book is going to be publishing in August. So we are so thrilled to have these really exciting books coming out from the University of Florida Press. And welcome to both of our authors today. I thought it would be nice to start with a brief summary. People might be coming to this without any knowledge of your books. So a brief summary about what your book is. And Beth, if we can start with you.
Sure thing. Thanks, Stephanie. I'm really excited to be here and to have this conversation. My book, on a kind of very straightforward level, is an attempt to offer a narrative of women's involvement in national level politics in the Dominican Republic from the 1930s through the 1970s, covering the 30-year regime of Rafael Trujillo, the years after his assassination, or ajusticiamiento, as it is talked about in the Dominican Republic, and then 12 authoritarian years of his successor, Joaquin Balaguer. But I'm also endeavoring in that sort of narrative to explain how, why, and with what consequences authoritarian regimes mobilized women into national level politics. And so I start by looking at pre-Trujillo feminist movements and kind of mobilization, and then move to the rise of the dictator, and how he then sort of effectively engaged women in the political scene, and then as well as how his successor did that, how they kind of frame women as citizens as part of their overall scheme of power, and how that worked to shore up their kind of power bases, right? But I also look at the ways in which kind of that backfired in certain ways, and the particulars of their regimes caused people to mobilize against them and women to mobilize against them. And that these kind of ultimately discourses of maternalism and paternalism have kind of ways in which they mobilize, but also ways in which they create problems and stumbling blocks for women within the feminist movement itself.
And that really is the paradox that you're referencing in the title.
Right, totally.
Right. Heather, so maybe you could tell us about your project and how it fits in with Beth's book.
Sure. So my project is the English language translation and critical edition of Minou Tavárez Mirabal's Mañana te escribiré otra vez, Minerva y Manolo cartas. And that's in that volume, Minou Tavárez Mirabal, who, for those who aren't familiar with her, is a political leader in the Dominican Republic today, but she's very well known for being the daughter of two martyrs in Dominican history, Mirabal, who is known as one of the butterflies, which perhaps people have heard of, the three sisters, the Mirabal sisters who were assassinated under the Trujillo regime, and Manolo Tavárez Justo, who was a political leader in the 14th of June movement and then political party, and he was assassinated as well. And she was very young when her parents were killed, about 4 and about 7 years old respectively. And so she's this project of hers is really a journey to search for who her parents were, kind of the people beyond the public image that she sees today, and to get to know them as much as possible because they were simply taken from her. And so she compiled as many letters as she could get her hands on, and she's at several points is very frustrated because there are big gaps in these letters because of the conditions in which her parents were living. But she frames these letters with her own memoirs that are informed by her own research as a scholar, discussions with other people who knew them. And she frames them with these memoirs / explanations that really help the reader to kind of navigate these letters and understand them as within the context of Dominican politics and history at the time, but also as her journey as a daughter trying to get to know her parents. And so my project was to translate this volume and then to add an introduction for the reader who might not be familiar with the Trujillo, the Trujillo regime, and to kind of orient the reader to that regime and to think about, actually with the help of Beth's work and the work of some others, to help to think about, what gender relations at the time might have been in play in terms of why Minerva is remembered today, why she was murdered the way she was, and kind of how we might think about her role in the resistance.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. And so I think Beth has some questions for Heather.
Yeah, Heather, I'm so excited to get to talk to you about this because you're translating and presenting a book that was, of course, originally published in Spanish. And that event was very exciting to me. I think I was in a department store and I saw it and I was like, what is this? And why did no one tell me about it? And of course, I'm probably being looked at as a weirdo. And so then when I found out that you were kind of bringing this to an English language readership, it was so very important to me that this come out, because I know that there is some public awareness of the story of the Mirabal sisters, particularly through Julia Alvarez's work, but there's not a lot more critical, right? And I often get questions that, tell us more about this story. And to me, it was like this opportunity to let the actors in this story speak for themselves. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your journey to translate this book. What compelled you to do this amazing project? And why do you think it's so important for English language readers to have access to these letters, to these sources, and to this interpretation?
Right. Thank you for that question, Beth. So my research prior to this and some classes that I teach have to do with representations of iconic women in Latin America. And one of the units in those classes, and there's an English version of the class and language version and a Spanish language version of the class. One of those units is on the Mirabal sisters. And the way that I came to know about them was through a personal connection with a former catorcista who was an important person in my life several years ago. And he told me a little bit about them. And so then I eventually, I read Julia Alvarez's novel and learned a bit about them. And in the Spanish language version of the class, I had access to Bebé Mirabal's memoirs and Vivas en su Jardín. And that was great. And I was able to have my students read, some excerpts from her memoirs. And I thought to myself, well, it's a shame that this isn't available in English. Somebody should really translate this so that I could have it in my English language class. And so I initially sent out to translate that book. And I went to the Dominican Republic and to the Casa Museo Hermanas Mirabal in Salcedo. And I made contact with the Fundación Hermanas Mirabal with that project in mind. And in the process, that's where I discovered Minou's book and purchased a copy and was able to start reading that and entered into conversation with Minou about these proposed projects. And then I ended up, we decided for me to translate her book, which I think was an excellent choice. And I remember reading it, I was sitting in a park one day, reading part of it. And I remember distinctly, there's the kind of the academic side of me, the scholarly side of me that was looking for information to kind of, fill out the story that I knew about Minerva and such. But I'm also the mother of two young girls. And so there were times when I just literally was moved to tears by the deep love that really pervades the entire volume. I mean, the love of a daughter who's just really desperately searching for any information that she can acquire about her parents. The love that compelled her parents to act, the love that supported them when they were making the sacrifices. And I remember checking on my daughters at night, like I always do, and thinking during those days that I was reading that volume, was being very thankful that they were there and I was here, and thinking about how terrible the situation must be for someone to risk that in order to continue struggling when they know that their life is on the line. So it was that deep love that I thought, and this kind of leads into your second question. I thought, people who are really interested in learning about the Trujillo and the Mirabal sisters, like obviously there's a wealth of information right here. It's very valuable for that. But for, just my friends and my family who maybe aren't necessarily looking for that, there's this deep human story about the love of a family and the people that supported them in spite of all the risks they were taking. And I thought, wow, like that's that love that really helps people to continue with the fight in spite of the risks that they're taking. That was really very compelling. And Minou was very supportive of the project, and she was very trusting. And I felt very honored that she trusted her parents' intimate letters, right? And her memoirs as their daughter. It was very valuable text to her, and she trusted me with that. And I felt very honored and very humbled by that. So that's how it
Yeah, that's amazing that she did, because it's not just a set of letters, right? It's her interpretation of those letters, which makes it such a unique piece. And wow, I mean, she's a major figure, right? She's a very important person.
Right.
and to know that you have that's really that's incredible.
Right. And her press has been amazing. She has been great there when I meet her to maybe clarify a few things, but very trusting and to kind of let me just go with it. And
that leads to a question that I have actually, because throughout the process, Heather, you and I spent some time talking about how to translate. Well, first I should say, so that there's like Beth said, there's the letters, and then they're encompassed in the kind of memoir, and then that's encompassed now in this translation that you've provided, and you have the trust of those people that you were translating. And in the review process and in the development process, we talked a bit about how to translate in a way that is clear for your reader, for your English speaking audience, but also faithful to Minou and her voice, and allows her voice to come through. So I wanted to get you to talk a little bit about some of those challenges that you had, because this is such a personal story. Challenges with the translation and with kind of bridging those two different audiences.
So one of the major challenges of this translation was just the multiplicity of voices that there were. So, we have, of course, Minerva and Manolo, but at different moments in their lives, in very different circumstances. And then 60 years later, more or less, then we have the voice of Minou, who at sometimes, and she even, points this out in her introduction, that sometimes she is the guide, and she kind of puts on more of her like scholarly hat and is guiding the reader through circumstances and such. And then in other times, you can almost hear her pause as she's writing, reflecting, and kind of this voice of the child Minou who is, remembering, these experiences almost comes through. And so even Minou's voice is multiple voices. So, right, that was definitely one of the biggest challenges. And I think, and my approach to it was simply, in terms of Minou, it was kind of to let her lead the way, right? So, I could, in her discourse, when she was kind of putting on that scholarly hat, I felt like that needed to come through. And so I tried to, that's a discourse I'm familiar with. And so I was trying to kind of be true to that. And then whenever she kind of went into a mode that was maybe more reflective, nostalgic, and kind of that younger child Minou kind of came through, tried to be faithful to that. And then with Minerva and Manolo, I found myself, because these letters were not meant to be read by really anybody but them. So, that was very humbling to be translating these. And I wanted to convey the affection that and the love that they felt for one another. But number one, this was 60 years ago, right? So language was different in English. Like the language that my grandparents used to use to speak to one another was, we would kind of, hear that and think, oh, that's kind of, quaint, So I would think about like, well, how would my grandparents have said that to one another? Or how would my grandparents have kind of framed that? But then I still kind of kept coming into encountering this problem of that in Spanish, there is a wealth, there's a treasure trove of ways to express affection through language, both in, lexicon or vocabulary, and also in, endings you can put on words and just ways to express affection, that if you try to translate that directly into English sounds, I don't want to say cheesy, but like people in English, it would sound very affected. People would not see that as something normal. So when there were terms of endearment that maybe were very easy to translate, like mi amor, okay, that was easy. But then there were many, many other ways that they expressed affection to one another. And I just chose to leave those in Spanish to kind of honor that, look, there are these ways to express affection that, I explained in the introduction, some of these terms, but I wanted to leave them there. I didn't want to take them out. I didn't want to try to translate them. Just kind of respect those for what they were. And finally, I just felt like I needed to let the, sorry, I have a strange window popping up on my screen here. Kind of let the language or the text take me to the moment. So I was very privileged to have a sabbatical in order to write this. So I had kind of the mental space and the time to really just dive into it. And I remember sitting in my office, kind of looking out the window many times. For instance, translating the letters in prison, and just kind of going there. I mean, the only way you can do it is to just go there and try to be in that moment. And it was painful sometimes to do that, but I was fortunate to have the time and the space in order to do that and just let myself feel as much as I could what the text was kind of dictating. And then finally, the most important thing I think was the external reviewers and the revisions and the friends who read it and said, it just, when I thought it was done, to have somebody say, it's still a little rough around the edges. It still needs to be smoothed out. I think it gave me permission to do that because I'm an emerging translator. Like this is something that I've dabbled in, but this is my first major project. And I so much wanted to honor their voices that I wasn't really sure. I wasn't comfortable with where that line was between honoring their voices and interpreting too much. And to have somebody say, you need to interpret just a little bit more to smooth it out for the reader. I kind of felt like they gave me permission to do that and realize that I was honoring them by doing that to try to help the reader access their stories. And that was hugely helpful.
Yeah, I think it was about finding that balance in the process. I want to turn to Beth now and kind of, so Minerva is one of the many kind of characters in your book, one of the many women who mobilized against the authoritarian regime. So I think Heather has some questions about Beth's work.
Right. So one of the things that was interesting to me was like all of these very rich, a wide variety of rich primary sources that you incorporated into your work. And I wonder, and a lot of these seem to me, to my knowledge, to be untapped sources of information. Which of them were, or maybe some of them that were most particularly illuminating for you or revealing for you, if you could discuss some of those.
Yeah, I mean, I was starting to think about this question, and my sort of super cop-out answer is all of them in which women appeared, right? Because when I first started to do this research, I found a number of kind of different resistances to women's history, right? The kind of women's history that I was finding or people were talking about were these lists of, in Spanish, we would say mujeres destacadas, right? The accomplished women. And there's kind of a laundry list of these women. And I thought, this is great. This is wonderful. I'd love that you honor these women. But where's everyone else? Where are the rest of them? And part of me was, kind of grappling with what I call big man history, these major figures, and in a place where Columbus, still lives large. It's not totally, and it's easy to see in some ways how, Trujillo, Columbus, that they kind of take over, they take up all the oxygen in the room. And also there's trauma, right, with remembering these authoritarian regimes and women sort of even more so. And so when I first started digging in the archives, and all I would get is these books that were lists of women, and I would get frustrated. And so if I found it, as I started finding things, and I found anything with women in it, right, and that was initially looking at the files of the Partido Trujillista, the party that was kind of ultimately created to mobilize women into the dictatorship, you know, and I was like, oh my gosh, they're everywhere, right? Even though these were sources that were written by women, they were written in a lot of ways, or at least the initial things that I found, they were written about them, right? And how to mobilize them. But the more I dug, the more I found things penned by women. And of course, when you're looking at a dictatorial or authoritarian regime, you have to be really skeptical, right? You have to look at these materials through the lens of what was expected of them, what was the script, right? How were they kind of assumed to perform within this political sphere? But I would say that like kind of the richest materials are the ones that come from the voices of the women that I was looking for, right? Or another really wonderful example for me was searching for the files of the women governors that Trujillo's successor, Joaquin Balaguer, appointed only women to the post of provincial governor in 1966 for the next 12 years. And I kept asking for these files, and we were sort of struggling to find them, / no one really knew or cared where they were. And eventually I just kept pushing for like 6 months, literally 6 months. I was like, I really want to see them, really want to see them. And there's this resistance to, you know, I think this is true in the US too, right? History looks a certain kind of way, and it looks like presidents in a row, right? There was this resistance that those things aren't going to tell you anything. You don't want them. You know, it's just dusty papers. And I said, I'll decide, just let's find them. And eventually we found this pile of papers that came up to my shoulder that were the files of these women governors and everything that they had tried to do in their provinces. And it was, you know, again, I know that they were writing within the context of an authoritarian regime, but at the same time, I found these richly complicated women, right? Balagueristas full, right? Like complete Balaguer supporters, and so problematic in certain kinds of ways, because Balaguer, many say, may have been even more kind of brutal than Trujillo in certain kinds of ways, but yet fierce advocates for their constituents, the people in their province, for children, for, you know, creating playgrounds and schools. And so they're these like very nuanced characters, right? You can't label them as good or bad. They are very complicated. And so for me, you know, initially was, you know, finding sources that kind of en masse talked about women, whether it was in the Partido or it was in, you know, different women's organizations or these women governors. But the more I was able to dig into them, really finding individual women's voices and thinking about the many, many complications and what it meant. And Heather, when you were talking earlier about the struggles to put yourself in that place, I mean, I think it's hard when you're working on dictatorship, because you do need to kind of put yourself there and be kind of forced to reckon with what it would mean to live in that space. And for, you know, for some people that meant resistance, and for others it meant different kinds of things and many compromises. And I think that's what made for me like this very rich, even if challenging and hard, because I didn't always love the women that I was looking at, right? And sometimes they were like, oh, a few of them that were really close allies with Trujillo, I wanted to, you know, like, I'm done with them, but they were also, you know, sort of complicated and needed to be unpacked as part of the story. So
and that kind of leads to this question of mythification of the martyrs, right? The complications that you found in all of these different women, and specifically the mythification of Minerva and the Mirabal sisters. I think Heather could maybe elaborate on that a little bit.
But in that respect too, I think that the our works really work in tandem, right? In the sense that, you know, Minou's book really seeks to see her mother as a flesh and blood human being and all her complexities, right? And I certainly, in trying to translate Minerva's letters, encountered some of her complexities. God love her. She was very well known for being highly intelligent, top of her class, you know, an excellent scholar. But these are letters that she wrote, maybe in a rush to get them off to the post office, or maybe she was feeling particularly anxious that day. And sometimes, dear Minerva was not really using punctuation in a conventional way, and it had to, confront that complexity. But it was a very intimate look at her as a flesh and blood individual in all of her imperfections, right? And then your work is extremely helpful because it kind of then zooms out and says, okay, now she was not the only one. Look at all of these other very complex, and I was actually going to ask you about like your experience of encountering some of these individual stories that appear in your work, and you kind of preempted that by just giving us that wonderful sharing that experience and encountering some of them. But you really zoom out and you say, okay, like look at this very complex situation. How do we understand it in the larger context, and how does it shape our understanding of the larger context? So your book was very helpful to say, Minerva was, and her sisters too, though she was really, I think, if her sisters had not been with her in that car that day, they probably would have survived, in my opinion. But like, it's, how does it, how can we understand, her as one of many examples of women who were mobilized during the time? And your work is very helpful and illuminating in that way. And then on the flip side, Minou's book says, well, how do we dig deeper and find out, what is the dynamic happening in an individual's life that helps them to be an activist when it's not easy to do so?
Yeah.
Both ends of the scope. I don't know.
Yeah. I think you have to kind of go both ways, right? You can kind of zoom in and zoom out. Because for me, people kept telling me this story, and I'm like, okay, well, the regime ended shortly after that fact, right? Like shortly after their deaths, the regime ended. So I'm not going to automatically give you causality from one to the other, but maybe we think about how those things are connected, and also they couldn't have been the only ones. So some of my first questions were like, okay, why are these the only activist women we talk about? They couldn't have been the only ones, right? And I wanted to understand them in a network of other women activists. And it's impossible to understand the movement, the resistance movement they were part of, without thinking about networks, because it was literally cellular. Right? Yeah. It was a network that went out, right, in these cells of three.
Right.
And so, and I also wanted to understand how they became, right? They didn't just wake up one day and be like, I'm going to resist a notoriously vicious and killer dictator, right? That there was a mobilization, and all of the stories I kept reading were attributing their politicization to other men. I was like, I'm not sure I'm fully buying these stories either. And I, in fact, talked to the brother of one of the purported mobilizers of Minerva's political kind of engagement. And he was like, yeah, no. And like that, he was like, she was already on a path to a political life, right? Mm-hmm. And so you start looking and digging into that, and you see all these women, right? These other women that were part of that network. And for me, that was so revelatory, right? And you start digging into the movement that they created, and you see these stories of her being a central figure in it. And so then it begs the question, why are women being kind of pushing this movement, right? And I think the ways in which the regime had mobilized people into it also pushed women to say, oh, you're professing to protect families and democracy, except you're not, right? And it was a kind of even deeper insult, and it was a way in which women become mobilized. So I think for me, digging deeper into the context helps it gives a bigger story, a story with more voices, but it also explains Minerva better, right?
Yeah.
It explains her and her story as not, she was exceptional, but she wasn't the exception.
Right. Great. That's well put. Well put. And both stories, I think, help to kind of reveal some of these webs of connections that existed, and that not only allowed for this resistance to continue, but also kind of encouraged it to do so because people, because these webs existed.
Yes, I think an important part of your book, Beth, is the transnationalism that the transnational networks that these women were part of. So that kind of brings me to my last question, which is kind of bring this to the present moment. How you think this legacy of women's activism and dictatorship is relevant today? How is it playing out in the contemporary world? What should we take from these stories today? I don't know who wants to go first.
Beth, would you like to go first?
Sure. I often feel like I'm defending the Dominican Republic and this tiny island and what its relevance, or not defending, but I'm often making a case for it, I'll say. And so I think kind of this story at a large, not just Minerva and Manolo and her sisters, right, but the entire story of dictatorship and authoritarianism in the Dominican Republic. It's not necessarily novel. I think that's important, right? This was happening across the region, across the globe, but it can really help us understand the ways in which dictatorship hardens and kind of lasts for a long time, how women are mobilized, what historical memory looks like. And Heather, I think this is where, kind of your work is so crucial because it has all these layers. I don't know. I mean, I've always held that the Dominican Republic sits literally at the center of the history of the Americas, right? It is where it begins. And so it has a relevance for that reason. But it also should be worthwhile to look at, considering contemporary political circumstances of conservative regimes and women's mobilization in them. I think we can think about, so how is that relevant, right? Not just how the history of this island sits in kind of a larger history that matters to us, but this particular set of stories is also kind of relevant to some things that are happening today, right? And it also matters that we think about telling different kinds of stories, right? Moving away from big man history, right? And towards histories that are more obscured or more silenced. And to that end, the struggle sort of at a broader level continues, right? Women in the Dominican Republic are still fighting for basic rights. And these kind of long reaching arms of certain kinds of regimes that, don't only exist in the Dominican Republic. We need to understand them, right? To better kind of unpack how we go about activism against conservative and fascist leaning regimes into the present, I think.
I would agree. And one thing that strikes me, and whenever I'm talking with students about this story and some others that maybe are similar, it's always very illuminating because it's in these courses that I teach about iconic women of Latin America. We start with, okay, this is this figure here that we, the Mirabal sisters, Manuela Sáenz, the Virgin of Guadalupe even. And we say, okay, this is the image that's presented. And then we start to dig deeper and see some of the complexities, like the complexities that you discussed. And it's amazing because the students really seem to kind of engage in a different way, like, oh, like I can kind of relate to this person, right? And they become very frustrated because they have their idea of what women access to, political positions and things like that women should have. And they become very frustrated when women didn't have this access. And so one day we were talking and we kind of came to the point that women have acted in many ways like water, right? And they come to, there's an obstacle, but then they kind of just find the cracks and go around and keep going, right? very dynamic ways. And you see it again and again and again. And I think that these stories kind of show that. It's like, okay, this current is flowing and you're going to be a rock in my path, but I'm going to go around you, over you. I'm going to help shape you a little bit, etc. And so I think we have to not lose heart, because we still have a long way to go with the way that, women leaders sometimes are discussed, even in our own country, in terms of, so, yeah, we won't go into those details, but we all know that gender is still very much an issue in our political system. And that women will just continue to be water. And not only women, individuals, people who find themselves not having access to the positions that they need in order to kind of enact policy changes will continue to act as water.
I love that analogy.
I do too. Yeah.
It was like 3 days ago.
Oh, that's awesome.
Well, thank you both so much. This concludes our Authors in Conversation with Beth Manley and Heather Hennes. You can check out both of their books published with University of Florida Press. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was great.
It was a pleasure.